I'm just gonna preface this by saying I don't really have a good mic or camera or lighting or anything, so sue me. The brain is arguably the most important organ and certainly the hardest to replace. For this, it has definitely become the most studied part of our bodies. And yet, paradoxically, we know the least about it. So much of the brain, its intricacies, how it operates are still a complete mystery to us. But no matter, as today, my friends, I will be giving you an insight into the brain nonetheless, or rather, a specific part of it. For I have answered the call of this fine gentleman to do so, and come on, how could you ever upset this face? Thus today I bring to you a dive into the prefrontal cortex is located at the very front of the brain. It is part of the larger frontal lobe and occupies its extreme front position just beyond the premotor cortex. Now, despite being such a specific part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex is actually quite large, taking up just over 10% of the brain's volume on its own. Because of this, the prefrontal cortex is sometimes divided into its own specific subdivisions as well, although their exact borders, locations, and functions tend to not be universally agreed upon. Common subdivisions of the prefrontal cortex usually include the dorsolateral, dorsomedial, ventrolateral, ventromedial, and orbitofrontal regions.
Oh wait, I missed a little bit on the side. Ah, come on.
The region's large size and many subdivisions help to show that it is quite important, thus making it no surprise that the prefrontal cortex is involved with a wide variety of functions. Now, the prefrontal cortex is mostly known for dealing with a certain type of task, that being executive functions. These are processes that control short-sighted behavior with the purpose of achieving a specific goal. A few examples of executive functions include planning, decision-making, problem-solving, impulse control, focusing attention towards something specific, setting and achieving goals, anticipating consequences, and time management. However, do note that the prefrontal cortex is only able to carry out these functions by working together with other surrounding regions of the brain. The prefrontal cortex relies on them to give its sensory information on the world around you, after which it is able to process that information accordingly and work together with the other parts of the brain to adapt and respond to any potential changes. Most brain functions tend to work in this way, with multiple regions in collaboration to complete a given task fully, as opposed to tasks being divvied up amongst separate regions entirely. Based on the evidence that we do have, it is most likely that those all-important executive functions of the prefrontal cortex are properly carried out due to the combined efforts and interaction of its subregions, as well as some regions outside of it. Alongside the more specific subdivisions that we covered earlier, the prefrontal cortex can also simply be divided into three regions, which are larger, easier to classify, and have a broader range of functions. The medial prefrontal cortex contributes to attention and motivation. The orbital prefrontal cortex deals with impulse control, ignoring distractions, and keeping emotions in check. The lateral prefrontal cortex deals with goals and plans, both in terms of creating them and executing them. An often overlooked yet still important function of the prefrontal cortex is its large role in personality development. Because it helps people make conscious decisions according to their motivations, the prefrontal cortex helps to develop certain behavioral tendencies over time, thus contributing to your personality. Of course, the prefrontal cortex doesn't house your entire personality and decision-making process, but it does play its part nonetheless. This only becomes more apparent as the prefrontal cortex, as well as the brain in general, furthers in its development. A quick side note here, but the brain develops in a back-to-front pattern as we reach maturity. This means that the prefrontal cortex is the last region of our brains to fully develop. This explains why we only exhibit complex decision-making, proper long-term planning, and consistent impulse control as we get older, and why your life is such a mismanaged mess. On the flip side, teens that face many dramatic life events and challenges may mature quicker, as experience and exposure to vast stimuli can help to develop synaptic connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. The lack of such connections, present in large numbers during adolescence, explains why us cool and hip young people tend to act more rashly and impulsively. Our prefrontal cortices just haven't fully developed their connections to other crucial areas, such as the limbic system, and so don't work as effectively. The prefrontal cortex is quite important to your brain functions, so breaking it is like not a really good idea. The exact effects of damage to it vary depending on which region is damaged and the extent of the damage. However, common themes amongst those suffering from prefrontal cortex damage include poor performance on long-term tasks, poor impulse control, lapses in short-term memory, and blunted emotional responses. If you want to get more specific, damage, or lesions according to nerds, to the medial prefrontal cortex usually causes those affected to become apathetic, unconcentrated, have trouble acting spontaneously, and struggle to initiate speech. Damage to the orbital prefrontal cortex results in increased irritability, reckless behavior, and a failure to properly respond to social cues. And damage to the lateral prefrontal cortex interferes with one's abilities to switch between tasks, recall where an instruction came from, or to adapt to changes in rules. And what of those who have suffered these damages and felt the consequences? Well, we're lucky, because whenever there's someone going through a traumatic and life-altering event that will permanently leave them to suffer through a tormenting existence beyond our most horrid imaginations, you can rest assured that there are probably psychologists and neurologists there to document every single step of the way. The most famous example of such a case study regarding the prefrontal cortex is that of Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker in Vermont in the mid-19th century, and while working suffered a freak accident. As he was packing down gunpowder with a tamping iron, the powder accidentally ignited, sending the iron up through his brain and out the other side. Miraculously, Gage actually survived this, and was seemingly even able to function normally as a human afterwards. However, the tamping iron destroyed much of his prefrontal cortex, and thus fundamentally changed his behavior for the rest of his life. Whilst Gage was known to be a reasonable, responsible, and hardworking man prior to the accident, afterwards it is said that he became disrespectful, impulsive, and troublesome. These symptoms seem to point to a significant loss of executive functions, given his near-complete lack of self-control and pursuit of long-term goals, which is also consistent with the damage that was done to his prefrontal cortex. Another often cited prefrontal cortex study came in 1876 from Scottish neurologist David Ferrier, a guy with some pretty weird experiments and even weirder facial hair. One of these experiments saw Ferrier remove large portions of the frontal lobes of monkeys, and yeah, this dude was he was pretty bad. But most importantly for us, that brain removal included the prefrontal cortex. Ferrier noticed that while the monkeys retained their instincts, senses, and intelligence, they had lost all of their attentiveness and appeared completely apathetic. They didn't work towards any forward goals and only responded to momentary stimuli out of necessity. These traits of someone with a damaged prefrontal cortex, especially in terms of executive functions, or lack thereof, are common throughout all such case studies. Overall, the importance of the prefrontal cortex can absolutely not be understated. It's true that as a community, us humans don't really know that much about our own brains, but even the basic knowledge that we have now is incredibly important, and I hope that those of you watching can properly retain what you've learned here today. Thank you for watching, and please enjoy the rest of our exhibition. Oh, and Mr. Bird, if you're watching, then please give me a good grade, or else this video is probably gonna look kind of weird otherwise. Alright, bye.